Yeshua continued. Yeshua did not replace Torah and the prophets. The apostles did not replace Torah and the prophets. We have Yeshua and Paul's word that say we still keep the Torah and the prophets. So those of you that are listening and you call yourself a Christian, the Passover was supposed to be continued and not made into what we're going to see, especially next week, Holy Communion, the Mass, the Lord's. All those are not relevant to those who follow Yeshua. Now, today we're going to start with Passover is a yearly feast that recalls the first Passover, recalls the Exodus. Exodus 12, 26, 27. And when your children ask you, what does this ritual mean? Passover, from the first Passover, is called a ritual. And it's something prescribed that needs to be followed. And needs to be followed exactly. There's no wiggle room with what Torah teaches us. Today we like wiggle room. Christianity is full of wiggle room. Some of the rabbis are full of wiggle room and ways to get around this and ways to get around that. And when your children ask you, what does this ritual mean? You will tell them, it is the Passover sacrifice, the Korban Pesach. Say with me, Korban Pesach. When we talk about the Passover, we're not just talking about the day. We're not talking about the feast, the ritual associated. When we talk about Passover, we're actually talking about the actual lamb, the Korban Pesach. The sacrifice, a lamb that was sacrificed. The center of Passover is a sacrificial lamb in honor of Yahweh, who passed over the houses of the Israelites in Egypt and struck Egypt, but spared our houses. Now notice what it says, when your children ask you. Passover, as I said a little while ago when we were blessing the children and reading the Torah scrolls, the main invited guests of Pesach are the children. It is not just an adult. I remember one time years ago we were doing Passover, and then one of my elders at the time, because when we were doing Passover, there was a lot of little kids, and they were, you know how kids are. They're kids. They're children. We're making some noise and says next year we should have a Passover with no children here, with no kids. What? When your children ask you, in fact, they are the most important guests at a Passover. Those of you that are going to be doing Passover, make sure you have children at your Passover. If you don't have any children, borrow some. Rent some. Don't kidnap any, you might get in trouble, but try to get children in there. It's for the next generation. I think every one of us has children, grandchildren. Yeah, they might not understand, but as they go, they might be playing around. But always remember how children learn. Children could be just playing around, not paying attention, and you say words, stuff like that. 2 days later, maybe a week later, they'll say exactly what you said, whether it's good or bad, by the way. They remember. And when your children ask you, what does this ritual mean? You will tell them, it is the Korban Pesach in honor of Yahweh who passed over the houses of the Israelites. He saved us by the blood of the Lamb, by this sacrifice. We were saved. We were set free from Egypt by the blood of the Korban Pesach. And of course, Exodus 10:2, Exodus 13:8, Deuteronomy 6:12, all talk about the same thing. And it's important for us to realize that Passover is an audio-visual teaching for kids. For kids. Whether you are a 2-year-old, whether you're a 12-year-old, well, you're a 23-year-old, well, you're 50 years old. Pesach is a continual audio-visual teaching. We hear it. We hear the songs. We hear the blessings over and over every year. And hopefully for the rest of your lives and the rest of your children's lives. That it'll be an audio-visual understanding of what Adonai did for us. When they see the matzah, when they see the cup, when they see the zeroah, the shank bone, when we teach them what these are, and we explain to them, and we actually eat of this, we actually eat and drink, we actually have a celebration. When our children see this every year, we put it into their heads. And then as we do a third part of Passover, which they didn't have. In fact, the original Passover did not have a third part. The third part was brought in by Yeshua the Messiah, as we're going to see. So Passover is an audio-visual. When your children ask you, what does this mean? You shall tell them it's the Korban Pesach, and use as much Hebrew. They might not understand it, but later on they will understand. Just let the Hebrew words go in. And of course, little by little, we teach them as they grow up. Now let's go to the book of Numbers. Last week we dealt with Exodus 12 and 13. And let's go to Numbers. And today we're going to study Numbers chapter 9. Now, remember what I've taught in the past, that Numbers chapter 9 is actually Numbers chapter 1. And Numbers chapter 1 is actually Numbers chapter 9. And so if you read chapter 1, it says there that Yahweh spoke to Moses in the wilderness, and that's why it's called Bamidbar, the wilderness, in the tent of meeting, in the first day of the second month, in the second year after the Exodus. So first day of second month of the second year. But if you go to Exodus chapter 9, verse 1, and Yahweh spoke to Moses in the wilderness, Bamidbar, in the second year after the Exodus from Egypt, in the first month, he said. In the first month, he said. So the other one was second month, this is first month. So the chronology-wise of the book, 9 comes before 1. And so in the first month, he said, by the way, we are waiting, and we are doing this study April 2nd of 2022. And in real time right now, we have contact with Israel. And last night, the crescent moon, the new moon, Rosh Hashanah moon, was supposed to be here last night. It didn't show up. And so it should be here tonight. But tonight, this morning, and right now, it's getting to be evening in Israel. And the new moon and the new year is proclaimed not in fact, they saw the moon in Fiji, but we're not, that's Fiji. Australia, they saw it, and other people saw it, other parts. But when Jerusalem, when Israel, so we have, we're in contact with someone from Israel right now, the moon still hasn't showed up right now. They're still looking. And maybe if during the teaching, if they get the sighting of the moon in Israel, give me a thumbs up, and we'll announce it live here that the moon showed up. Now we follow a schedule of the sighted moon. We do not follow the rabbinic calendar, the Hillel 2 calendar, that makes the new moon the conjunction. We do not follow the conjunction new moon. We follow the sighted crescent moon. So if they see it in Israel within the next hour or so, then we will proclaim it. And then tonight we will be able to see it in our horizon. But watch this. Yahweh spoke to Moshe in the desert of Sinai in the second year after the Exodus in the first month. And he said, okay, so they've been in Sinai for 1 year. Moshe has been up and down Mount Sinai several times. He's received the first set of stones, and they were broken, the second set of stones, and they built the tabernacle. The tabernacle was built. They dedicated. They had their first Hanukkah, and all that has occurred. Now, the whole year has taken place, and this is time, like he says, and you shall keep it as a memorial. So on this second year, the Israelites must keep the Passover at its moedim, at its moed, at its appointed time. The 14th day of this month at twilight is the time appointed for you to keep it. You will keep it with all the protocols and customs proper to it. Now, the 14th day of this month at twilight. What is twilight? In Hebrew, it's actually between the two evenings. In Hebrew, it's between the two evenings. And regardless of what people say between the two evenings are today, and the traditions that have risen about that, and because of the Second Temple period and the growth of Judaism at the time, Second Temple Judaism, we're going back to Moses. We're going back to Moses to get our schedule. Not to Second Temple Judaism, not to the traditions of the elders, or even the Mishnah or the Talmud today, or Maimonides or Rashi. We want to go to Moses. So the 14th day of this month at twilight, twilight is between the two evenings. In other words, when the sun goes down over the horizon is the first evening. When the sun goes down over the horizon, it's the first evening. And then it'll become dusk, and it'll become darker and darker. And then when the sun goes down, it is still light enough. You look at the sky's still blue. But as the evening goes on, all of a sudden, as the sky turns darker, you start seeing one star. And then you'll see a second star. And then you'll see a third star. By the mouth of 2 or 3 witnesses, everything is established. And the second evening is established by twilight, by 3 lights in the sky. And as by that time, it is dark. So this in-between time, every day has an in-between time. And this is the beginning of the new day. Remember, the Hebraic day, the biblical day, begins at sunset between the two evenings. And you have that no man's land in a sense, that DMZ area type of between the two evenings. And so this was the time, as soon as the first evening came, then you slaughtered the lamb, you sacrificed the lamb. In Moses' time, it was in Goshen. Later on, it was here at the tabernacle. And so on the 14th day at twilight is the time appointed for you. Again, there's no wiggle room. This is the only time when you could do Pesach, when you could sacrifice and then later on do what we call the ritual, the Seder. By the way, the word Seder means the order of service or the ritual or the liturgy of the Passover, the service of the Passover, the Seder of the Passover. These are different synonym words that we could use. It's the appointed time for you to keep it. You will keep it with all the protocols and customs to it. There are protocols. There's mishpatim and chukim. Again, we're not talking about the takanot and the mincha. Those are insertions that have been brought in. We're talking about mishpatim and chukim that Adonai gave us. So the second Passover here in the book of Numbers, chapter 9, verse 4. Moshe gave orders for the sons of Israel to keep the Passover. They kept it in the wilderness of Sinai in the first month, on the 14th day of the month, between the two evenings. The sons of Israel did exactly as Yahweh had ordered Moses. They did exactly as Yahweh had ordered Moses. This is what I want to get to in my life, in our congregation, and I want to teach every one of you that we must do exactly as Adonai ordered Moshe. If anyone, verse 10, if anyone, Yahweh spoke to Moshe, and he says, say to the sons of Israel, if anyone among you, now let's go on here. Okay, these are the customs and the mishpatim and chukim proper to it. Remember what happened on the first Pesach. On the 10th of the first month of Aviv, the lamb was selected. The lamb had to be 1 year old without blemish. It was kept at home. This is one of the first protocols, mishpatim and chukim. Can't be any day, any other day. It has to be this day. The lamb has to be 1 year old, can't be 2 years old. Has to be without blemish, can't have any blemish. And it's kept at home. Now, it's in two parts. The sacrifice and the ritual. Passover, the Mosaic Passover in the first Passover, and now in the second Passover, it's in two parts. Part number 1, on the 14th, at twilight, when you see the 3 stars, the lamb was sacrificed at the tabernacle, the blood on the altar. Now remember, the first Pesach at twilight, between the two evenings, the lamb was sacrificed in front of the home, and the blood was put on the doorpost and lintel of the house. The first Passover, that was only on the first Passover. From then on, that ritual wasn't done. From the second Passover on, the ritual that is done is it's taken to the tabernacle. And at the tabernacle, the lamb was sacrificed. The blood of the lamb was put on the altar by the priest, and the carcass went to the family group. Every family group selected a lamb for that family group. They brought it now to the tabernacle. In the second and subsequent Passovers, they brought it to the tabernacle, sacrificed it. The blood was put on the altar of the tabernacle, and the carcass was sent home, and there it was roasted. And part number 2, the second part, was eaten with unleavened bread and bitter herbs at home with the Father presiding. In the first Passover, the Father, can you imagine the first Passover? They had never done anything like this. And Moses tells these million or so people what to do, and they did it. We're not talking about a little congregation like that. We're talking about 1 million, 2 million plus people. And they did it exactly as Yahweh had ordered in 2 parts. Sacrificing of the lamb, the Korban Pesach, the blood on the doorposts and lintels of the house on the first one, the blood on the altar on the second and subsequent ones. And it was eaten with unleavened bread, with bitter herbs, with the Father presiding. It was the Father who put the blood on the lintel. It was the Father who sacrificed the lamb at the tabernacle and brought it home. And then he tells the story. The Haggadah is the telling of the story. And it's the telling of the story of Pesach. Now, on the first Passover was sacrificed in the home at Goshen. The second and subsequent Passovers were done at the tabernacle from the wilderness to Shiloh to Jerusalem. From the time of Solomon, the first temple, only in Jerusalem. So from the time of Solomon, the only place where you could do a sacrifice lamb was in Jerusalem, as it still goes today. The last Passover sacrifice, the last Korban Pesach, was in 70 AD, when the temple was destroyed by Titus, the Roman prince. And so if anyone was in, for example, Tiberias, or they were in the Galilee, or they were in Beersheba, or they could not do a sacrifice. They could only do a memorial meal, what we call today a Seder, with no lamb. No lamb. You could only remember it, but you could not have the ritual item of a lamb. That could only be done in Jerusalem. Passover is a home fellowship. This is part of the rituals and the customs and mishpatim chukim to it. The Passover lamb was brought home from the sacrifice, from part 1, and prepared at home. There was the baking of unleavened bread. Now, the baking of unleavened bread is very simple. All you need is flour, some olive oil, water, and make it into a dough, and then you roll it with a rolling pin into flat breads. In Spanish, we call those tortillas. So tortillas are actually the biblical unleavened bread. In fact, I was doing some research on this, and some of the communities, some of the Sephardic communities, what they do is they not only put the dough and the flat bread in the oven so it could bake, but some of them get the dough and they make into round cakes, and then they dip them into oil, olive oil, and or oil of lamb oil, and they dip them and deep fry them. Now, when you do that, I'm thinking, wait a second, isn't that what we call a sopaipilla? Isn't that what some people call Indian bread? And so, as long as it is unleavened or with no leaven. Do not add any leaven to it. You could either deep fry them, or you could bake them in the oven, or bake them on top of the oven in a metal. So that's unleavened bread. Of course, many people buy the ones at the store, and the ones at the store are many of them made in Israel and made under rabbinic supervision, and they use those. But I would encourage every one of you, part of the family, bringing the family in and teaching the kids, I would encourage everyone to make your own at home. Do a Google search on how to make homemade unleavened bread, homemade matzah, with no chametz, no leaven. Now, the picking of the bitter herbs and making the sop. Now, this is interesting because I caught something the other day when we were talking about. Notice that it says, Paul mentions about Yeshua in the singular, not the plural. And it's interesting, it says, you shall eat it with bitter herbs. It doesn't say you shall eat it with a bitter herb. When we think of a bitter herb, most people today use horseradish, right? Horseradish. But notice that what they used, and they made it into a sop, and it's plural, bitter herbs. So I'm going to encourage every one of you, get all these bitter herbs, all the different kinds of bitter herbs, and get it in, you could put olive oil in there, make it a base of olive oil, and get all these different herbs that you have that are bitter and put them in there. Dandelions, in fact, dandelions is a big one throughout Europe and Spain and some of those places. And bitter herbs, the leaves of the dandelion are very bitter. Get all these and make it into a sop, and then you could blend it together and make it into that. I'll tell you what my mom used to call it. The lamb was roasted at home. Again, this is in the Passover before 70 A.D. The lamb was roasted at home. Everything, head, in fact, it says even entrails, and they would get the menudo, clean it out, and put it in there and eat it with even menudo. The preparation of other foods for the meal. Remember, this is a celebratory Thanksgiving meal. So from now on, it's a Thanksgiving feast. Think of our American Thanksgivings with turkey and all. And so we make a big thing of it. But the biblical Passover was the national 4th of July, national Thanksgiving, national barbecue of Israel of the year. This was the biggest barbecue of the year. Everybody was roasting lamb throughout the whole community of Israel, throughout the Sinai, throughout the time when we went in to Shiloh and Jerusalem. It was the smell of the roasted lamb and all the other. It's a celebratory time. It's a time of celebration. And of course, part 2 is telling the story. Telling the story of the lamb. And of course, they had an actual lamb there. And we'll get deeper into this. And of course, it was eaten festively and joyously. This was not only the first Passover, but this was especially in the second Passover. Now let's go to Numbers 10. Numbers 10. Go to actually 6. It happened that certain men had become unclean by touching a dead body, that they could not keep the Passover that day. They came that same day to Moshe and Aaron and said to them, we have become unclean by touching a dead body. Why should we be forbidden to bring an offering to Yahweh at the proper time with the rest of the sons of Israel. Moses answered, wait there until I learn what orders Yahweh gives about you. Now, one of the things that we believe in is we believe in what's called progressive revelation. Adonai progressively gave revelation to Moses. All the time, Adonai spoke to Moses, and then sometimes even Moses said, Adonai, what about this? And Adonai would give him progressive revelation. And it's important to know that we ourselves cannot add or subtract. But Adonai can add and or subtract. Remember, the master of the house has authority, and he's given authority to his son. All authority has been given to me, Yeshua said. So the authority of the Father is in the Son. But we do not have authority to add and take away, but Adonai does. And so he says, wait until I get orders from Yahweh. And Yahweh spoke to Moses and said, this is what you are to say to the sons of Israel. If anyone among you or your descendants becomes unclean by touching a dead body or is on a journey abroad, he can still keep the Passover for Yahweh. Such a person will keep it in the second month on the 14th day between the two evenings. They are to eat it with unleavened bread and bitter herbs. Nothing is to be left until morning, nor must you break any of its bones. They must keep the Passover exactly according to the Passover ritual. And so it's interesting that this is the only Chag, this is the only Moed where Adonai allows a redoing, a doing of the Passover if you were unable to make it on the first, if you have a legitimate reason, by the way, a trip abroad or you're unclean, then you could offer on the second month, on the 14th, exactly 30 days later. And according to the ritual, you can't add or you can't take away from the ritual, but Adonai gave this new revelation to Moses. Now let's go on here in verse 13. But if anyone who is clean or who has not gone on a journey fails to keep the Passover, he shall be outlawed, excommunicated from his people. He has not brought the offering to Yahweh at its appointed time. So if you are clean and you don't do Passover, you don't bring the Passover offering, then you are excommunicated. So one of the most important things that I always make sure people know this, that we're supposed to keep Passover unless something happens, then we could keep it on the second month. But if we're clean and say, hey, I'll just, wait till next month, or I won't do it anyways, it's okay, with that wiggle room that I was talking about, then we're in trouble before Adonai. And then goes on to say, verse 14, if a gerim, if a proselyte, a proselyte is living among you and keeps the Passover for Yahweh, he must keep it in accordance with all the mishpatim and hukim of Passover. There is to be one hukim for settler, for gerim, for proselyte, and native alike. So a gerim is someone, a foreigner, a stranger, someone from another country that has become part of Israel. He's a gerim. He is no longer someone who is passing through or just living here, someone who has taken part of Israel. It says he has to keep it. So look at this idea. Look at this very carefully. Here in Sinai, In the second year, there was many Gerim. Remember, there was a mixed multitude that came out with Moses from Egypt. Some of them might have been slaves. Some of them might have been from countries south, Nubia and Ethiopia. Some of them might have been from Libya or other places that were also enslaved with the Hebrews. And when they came out, when the Hebrews came out, a mixed multitude came. And many of them kept to their, I'm sure, to their original religions. But many of them became Gerim, remember, they're not in the land. We're not in the land yet. We're still traveling. We're in Sinai. These people became proselytes. Another one, a proselyte is someone who is from another race, religion, who leaves that religion, leaves that group, and wants to become one with Israel. Then, once he's a Gerim, then he is allowed to intermarry with the Hebrews. They're allowed to be part of Passover. In fact, their males have been physically circumcised by this time. And there's one hukim, one law. There's one law for native and for the Gerim. There's not two laws. Today, even in much of Messianic Judaism today, a lot of people do two laws. Oh, this is for if you're Jewish and this is if you're Gentile. No, there's only one Torah. There's one Torah, one people, the olive tree of Israel. And we must keep to that. The 40th Passover, for 40 years now, we just saw the second Passover. What did they do for those 40 years in the wilderness? We don't have no information, at least biblically. There might be outside sources in all the writings that they have. But since we follow the scriptures, it's safe to say there is no reference from the first Passover, from the second Passover, till Joshua's Passover. When they enter the land, what did they do for 40 years? Did they have Passover? Did they observe it? It is safe to say we don't know. Now, a lot of people might say, well, I know, yeah, they did, but that's speculation. Oh, no, they didn't. That's speculation. These are assumptions that people make. To be biblically safe and biblically correct, we have to say what? I don't know. But let's go to Deuteronomy. And 40 years later, remember, Deuteronomy was written 40 years later from Numbers 9. 40 years later from Numbers 9, Deuteronomy was written. And there's two scriptures here. Deuteronomy 16 is the main one we're going to look. But I think there's another one that I was kind of reading, and I was thinking I was going to say something about. Okay. Yeah, let's go to Deuteronomy 16 and verse 1. Observe the month of Aviv and celebrate the Passover of Yahweh, your Elohim, because it was in the month of Aviv that Yahweh, your Elohim, brought you out of Egypt by night. And so 40 years later, in the land of Moab, right across from Jericho, before Moshe is taken and before Joshua leads the people, Moshe teaches us here to observe the month of Aviv and celebrate the Passover from Yahweh. Now, did they do it for the last 40 years or some of those years? I don't know. Because it was on that month that Yahweh brought you out. You must sacrifice a Passover. You must have a Korban Pesach from your flock or your herd for Yahweh your Elohim. In the place, watch this, in the place where Yahweh chooses to give his name a home. Now at this time, we don't know. We don't know where that place was. We're going to find out with Solomon that it's Jerusalem. But at this point, he just says, looking forward, you're going to do this. You must eat unleavened bread with this. For 7 days, you must eat it with unleavened bread, the bread of emergency, the bread of haste, in another translation. And it says, therefore, it was in great haste that you came out of the land of Egypt. So you will remember all the days of your life, the day you came out from the land of Egypt. For 7 days, no leaven must be found in any house throughout your territory, nor must any of the meat that you sacrifice in the evening of the first day be kept overnight until morning. You must not sacrifice the Passover in any of the towns that Yahweh your Elohim gives you, but only in the place where Yahweh your Elohim chooses to give his name a home. Again, 2 Chronicles 6:6 tells us this is Jerusalem. There you must sacrifice the Passover in the evening at sunset, at the hour, at the moment, at the hour at which you came out of Egypt. You must cook it and eat it in the place Yahweh your Elohim chooses, and in the morning you are to return and go to your tents. For 6 days you shall eat unleavened bread. On the seventh day there shall be assembly for Yahweh your Elohim, and you must do no work. Exactly as Leviticus 23, 5 and 6 and 7 say. So 40 years later, the same thing, the same ritual. Of course, subsequent Passovers, Joshua 5:10, 2 Kings 23:21, and 2 Chronicles 30:1 through 18. So throughout the history of Israel, we see that Passovers were celebrated. Now we have the Babylonian Exile. In 586, the Babylonians destroyed Solomon's temple and took Judah into captivity without the temple in which to sacrifice. The Passover was ended as ritual sacrifice for 70 years. So for 70 years, there was no Korban Pesach. For 70 years, there was no sacrificing the lambs. What did they do? We believe most or some of, because of what Jeremiah teaches us and the prophets tell us about the scribes and the elders of Israel, there was probably some additions that when they came back from captivity, they probably added and took away some things, because by the second temple, we see a whole different structure. We are not aware, again, of how the Jews who stayed in the land or those who went to captivity celebrate the Passover. Again, we're not privy to that. Adonai did not show that to us. But after the exile, Nehemiah, Ezra, Zerubbabel rebuilt the temple and reinstituted Passover. So the Israelites who had returned from exile, and now those who had renounced the filthy practices of the people of the country, joined them in restoring to Yahweh Elohim, and they ate the Passover. Again, did they not eat it for 70 years? Of course not. You didn't have a temple. What did they do? I don't know. The Passover, again, was in two parts. The sacrifice at the temple, the Korban Pesach, and the ritual with a celebratory meal, telling the story, what we call the Haggadah. Remember this day on which you came out of Egypt. on this day, in the month of Aviv, you are leaving, and when Yahweh has brought you into the land, you must observe this rite in the same month. And on that day, you will explain to your son, this is because of what Yahweh did for me when I came out of Egypt. And of course, they had just come out of Babylon. And so now their Passover has some of those elements in it. The Passover procedure, of course, is the blessing. All fellowships began and ended with a blessing of the cup. Here are some scriptures that talk about the cup, and that is something joyous and something you do. Of course, Melchizedek, Jacob, and there's many scriptures on the joyfulness of the cup. The Korban Pesach, a portion the size of an olive, was eaten to remember the first Passover, again, in Jerusalem only, in the tabernacle in Jerusalem. And the lamb, when they got the lamb, they got just a piece, and they just ate a piece of lamb, and they remembered. It was not, the eating of the sacrificial lamb was not for food. It was for remembering the first Passover. The unleavened bread was eaten to remember the haste, the bread that didn't have time to rise. The bitter herbs were eaten to remember the bitterness of slavery. It's what we call a sop. How many have ever heard that term, un chimisture? What's a chimisture? Yeah, mixture, right? A mixture. I remember my mom used to call it a chimisture. Your dad used to call it too. Anybody else? Chimisturia. Yeah, same thing, just different little pronunciation. And it means a mixture, and it's usually herbs, again, with a base of olive oil. And sometimes they used to use that to baste other meats, or used to eat it by itself, with very much like a salsa with chips. In fact, I don't know if you realize this, but eating salsa with chips, the chips are unleavened. They don't have leaven. And the salsa is a bitter herb. So eating salsa and chips is like eating the sop. Look at that. And our family has done that for years and years and years. The Magid, the father recites the story to the children. My father was a wandering Aramean. A wandering Aramean was my father. And we talk about the 10 plagues and the Passover. The meal after the Magid, the meal, a celebratory meal with a second lamb called the Chagigah, is eaten with other foods. So they had the Chagigah lamb that you could eat as much of that as you wanted. You could break the bones. You could keep it for leftovers 2-3 days. But the Korban Pesach, the Passover lamb, that had to be a special lamb. But there was a second lamb. Of course, today most people do not eat lamb at Passover. We do. But many people eat chicken or turkey, roast beef, or something else. In fact, some people have vegetarian Passovers now. And then again, it ends with praises from the Psalms, the Hillel Psalms. This was the Passover procedure as it came to be codified. And that's it. This is it. Nothing else. The Passover ritual elements are unleavened bread, the Korban Pesach, and the bitter herbs. That's it. In fact, today, many people have what they call a Seder plate. If you have a Seder plate like this, toss it, because this is not biblical. The only thing that we need, in fact, the only two, you could actually use it if you have a real nice one, don't break it. But the only thing that you could do is the bitter herbs. Here's the bitter herbs. And here is, well, we don't have lamb today. And so what we do is, again, today we use the shank bone to remember to remember the lamb. And of course, we have the bitter herbs and the matzah bread. So all you need today is matzah bread and bitter herbs, unchi mistura, the bitter herbs. That's all you need. These other things are addition. The egg, that's an addition. Now, for the bitter herbs, you could actually use parsley, lettuce, horseradish root, arugula, and all these other, and have that mixture. But this idea of the parsley and the salt water, or the haroshet, haroshet is a good dessert. That was it's a Middle Eastern dessert, but it's not part of the Seder plate. The biblical Seder plate only had this. Moses only had this. All through Scripture, they only had this until additions and subtractions started coming in, telling the story. It's about telling the story to the next generation, to the children, and to those whom Adonai has called. Every year, Yeshua's parents used to go to Jerusalem for the Feast of Passover. When he was 12 years old, they went up for the feast as their custom. And so here we have the boy Yeshua at 12 years old. By the way, this was not his bar mitzvah. There was no bar mitzvahs in the time of Yeshua. And so a lot of people say, oh, he went. No, they went to Jerusalem because it was Passover. And every year they went. Now we stop here. Next week we'll continue with part 3. Passover is the day Yeshua inaugurated the new covenant and died for the sins of mankind. And so it's important for us to remember as we're preparing for Passover, that the Passover is a time of redemption. It's a time when Israel was set free from Egypt, from Pharaoh, from slavery. But there's another kind of slavery, and that's the slavery of sin. Anything that is not of faith is sin. Faith is trust. If we can't have faith, if we can't have trust, anything that is not of faith is of sin. What is faith? Faith is obeying what Adonai says, sometimes even before we get an understanding of the meaning of it. Now, many times we'll get the understanding of the meaning when Adonai says, don't kill. Well, we get the understanding, but sometimes as we're reading Scripture, both the Tanakh and the apostolic writings, we're reading, and sometimes we don't get the understanding right away, and we say, well, I'll do it when I understand. That's a very Greek way of thinking. But what Adonai is calling us to is to believe what his word says. Yeah, sometimes we don't understand the why. He knows the why. Children don't understand why. Do not put your finger in that plug. They don't understand why until they get a zap, maybe. And even then, how many times have we gotten zapped for different things and still don't come to an understanding? But Adonai wants us, by faith, to receive these things. If we receive the Mosaic Passover, and then next week we're going to look at the Messianic Passover, and we receive what Adonai says and do what he says exactly. If they could do it exactly, we could do it exactly. So by faith, let's start. By faith, let's start saying, okay, I'm going to do what you say. I might not understand it. I might not have a complete understanding of it, but because you said to do it this way, I will do it this way. Let's go ahead and stand. Father, we thank you for the opportunity that we have today to come and study just some of these secrets, Father, some of these things that have been hidden. Father, and I wish we had more time because there's so much. In the name of Yeshua, Father, I ask that your Ruach would allow us to learn more and more about Pesach. And next week, as we continue with part 3 and start looking at Yeshua's Passover, that we may be able to understand not only the first Passover of the redemption of our ancestors from Egypt, but the redemption of mankind from sin through the purchase price of Yeshua's blood. Yeverechecha Yahweh vayishmerecha, Ayir Yahweh panavelecha vichunecha, Asa Yahweh panavelecha, vayasem lecha. Shalom. May Yahweh bless you and keep you. May Yahweh make his face shine upon you and be gracious unto you. May Yahweh lift up the light of his countenance upon you and give you his peace. Shalom, shalom. Have a good day. Shalom, shalom. Welcome to Olive Tree Fellowship and Torah Unleashed Ministries. Thank you for joining us on our channel. If you have enjoyed this teaching and would like to see more, please like and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Don't forget to click the notification bell so that you can be notified when we have new videos. If you would like to support Olive Tree Fellowship and Torah Unleashed Ministries, please visit us at olivetreefellowship.com or torahunleashed.org. We thank you for your past support and hope to continue with you. Shalom, shalom. Have a good day. Shalom, shalom y bienvenidos a Olive Tree y a la Torah desatada. Les doy gracias a ustedes y a Adonai por su apoyo que nos han dado aquí. Y si quieren continuar a hacer una donación, pueden ir aquí en torahunleashed.org o en olivetreefellowship.com y ahí pueden dar una donación. Su apoyo, su ayuda es importante en estos días. Shalom, shalom.